So back in 2022, director Ty West released a horror film called X. Many of you have probably seen it. All the people who get killed are filming an adult movie, and yet somehow the horniest person on screen is like an 80-year-old woman. And this was, I said this in my review at the time, a love letter to classic old slasher franchises. It played with some tropes, subverted them, but the influences were undeniable. But now we have a sequel to X just released in theaters called MAXXXINE, and here, unfortunately, the primary inspiration that it seems to be taking from classic slasher franchises is that the sequel's just not nearly as good. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Jake, the Scary Story Guy, and today we are talking about MAXXXINE, one of the most highly anticipated horror movies of the year. Ty West released the first two films in this, I guess you could call it a trilogy, to rave reviews. X and its prequel, Pearl, both garnered an awful lot of attention and acclaim. X was about a group of people getting murdered by an old couple, and Pearl kicked things all the way back to 1918 for an old woman origin story. And these films were released in very quick succession. Pearl came out just a few months after X, and people were buzzing about that because that's quite unusual. And then at the end of Pearl, we found out there's going to be a part 3 called MAXXXINE about the final girl from X, and it's going to have a bigger budget. The cast is absolutely loaded. Everyone wants to be a part of this thing. The hype is real. But unfortunately, MAXXXINE did not deliver on that hype, at least not for me. And don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean I think that MAXXXINE is a bad movie, but while X and Pearl are genuinely special films, in my opinion, MAXXXINE is just aggressively ordinary and only really seems to be trying to replicate the success of its predecessors in some pretty superficial ways. So MAXXXINE stars Mia Goth as Maxine Minx, the only survivor from the big porn star massacre a few years back. She's now trying to make it in Hollywood as a mainstream actress. She just really wants to be a star. And things are looking up for our girl. She lands the starring role in a horror movie, but then all of a sudden her friends start dying, disappearing mysteriously. It's like, what's going on? Now, as with X and Pearl, Mia Goth is the main attraction of this movie. She's one of the most talented actresses working, for my money, and she's really good at horror movies, and she really likes doing them, thankfully, so she's kind of got the Scream Queen crown right now. But it seemed to me that she didn't have as wow of a performance as she did in the first two films, largely because she just doesn't have as much to do, especially as this movie goes on. There's a scene early on where MAXXXINE is auditioning for the horror film that she wants to be a part of, and Mia Goth is so good at this, it's just like, we are so back, but that energy is never really captured and harnessed or built upon. This movie has a pretty star-studded cast, almost too much so, I think, because it does kind of feel like, okay, make sure that so-and-so's on screen for so long, make sure they get this many lines, and as a result, it ends up feeling like nobody quite has enough to do. We've got Kevin Bacon as a sleazy detective, kind of doing his version of Daniel Craig's Benoit Blanc from the Knives Out movies. We've got Elizabeth Debicki, Gus Fring from Breaking Bad, Michelle Monaghan, Bobby Cannavale. The singer Halsey is in this momentarily, using a truly astonishing New Jersey accent. Speaking of accents, Lily Collins is on screen for a few minutes as well, and doesn't quite seem to be able to decide whether her character is British or Irish. But like I said, this did end up feeling like less than the sum of its parts, because other than Kevin Bacon, I don't know that any of these people were really used to great effect. Also, I suppose I should mention this, don't go into MAXXXINE expecting a horror movie, because for some reason it's not. I mean, X and Pearl, they both had some other stuff going on, but the primary genre of those movies is definitely horror. Not so with MAXXXINE. This is more like a detective noir movie, but the tension and shock of the first two films is almost entirely absent here. There are a couple of shocking scenes, but they feel so isolated from the rest of the movie that their effect doesn't linger. One of them in particular feels almost like it was added in post-production, like the studio was like, hey, why'd you give us a PG-13 movie? Throw some gore in there. X has really fun and inventive kills. Pearl is a really intriguing character study of a woman who's losing her grip on reality, while MAXXXINE, it just kind of plods along. There's no overarching vision to this. At one point, the director of the film that MAXXXINE's starring in says, I want this to feel like a B movie with A ideas, which incidentally, that's a pretty accurate description in my view of the first two films in this series. This feels like the exact opposite. This is an A movie with B ideas, and frankly, I much prefer it the other way around. It was almost like the movie was self-conscious about the fact that a lot more eyeballs would be on it because of the success of the first two films. So while X was made as a love letter about slashers for slasher fans, MAXXXINE felt like it was made for a very general audience. For example, the director of this movie, she's walking MAXXXINE around the studio where they film all the movies, and she stops right in front of the Bates Motel, and the most prominent thing on the screen is the big sign that says Bates Motel. And then she's like, this is where they filmed the movie Psycho. And it's like, well, yeah, we know. Who are you telling? Imagine walking in front of a giant castle with a big sign that says Hogwarts in front of it and being like, this is where Harry Potter went to school. It's okay to expect something from your audience. Now, I'm not giving any spoilers, but the last thing I want to talk about here is the ending, because I really did not think that MAXXXINE stuck the landing. It just kind of felt like Scooby-Doo. Like, oh, you know, we've wondered who's under the mask, and now we know who's under the mask, and now they're explaining why they did it, and now the movie's over. There's just nothing memorable about the last act of this movie. I mean, there's 2 seconds. There's 2 seconds that are very funny in like a what the f kind of way. But other than that, I mean, it's just shockingly bland and generic. It's almost hard to believe that this is the same director and franchise as X and Pearl, because even having seen those movies 2 years ago, I still remember so much more about them than I remember about MAXXXINE, which I saw just a few days ago. It also doesn't feel very, like, rewatchable. I guess the only thing kind of pulling me along was like, all right, well, let's find out who's doing this. But now that I know and am just thoroughly whelmed by it, I can't imagine ever wanting to revisit this movie again. Now, happily, the comparative failure of MAXXXINE does not diminish the standing of X or Pearl in my eyes. Those movies stand perfectly well on their own. In fact, I want to rewatch them right now. They're so good. But guys, at the end of the day, this is a weird comparison, but I'm getting a Song of Ice and Fire vibes. George R.R. Martin had published 5 of the 7 books in the series by the time that Game of Thrones became the biggest show on television. He was supposed to finish writing the books, but he hasn't. With all these extra eyeballs on him, it's like he just can't do it. This really felt like a movie that was hampered by the success of its predecessors. Now, granted, Ty West didn't freeze up completely. He at least put something out there, but it's just so bland and lacking the ingenuity of the first ones that was this even needed? X and Pearl were bold, innovative, risk-taking projects with some real passion behind them. I didn't feel any of that here. And again, don't get me wrong, it's not an actively bad movie. Mia Goth and Kevin Bacon are great in it. There's some mystery going on. Ty West is obviously very, very capable behind the camera. It just, if you'll pardon the bad pun, it just doesn't have that X factor. And that's a shame. I'm gonna give MAXXXINE a fairly tepid 2.5 stars out of 5. Alright guys, as always, stay tuned for more spooky content coming soon. But in the meantime, thank you for watching this video, and here's hoping you survive to see the next one.